Industrialization has brought a number of benefits to global society, but it has also come with tremendous ecological and biological costs. The soil we till, the water we drink, and the air we breathe are increasingly contaminated with the toxic byproducts of industrial production. Every day we come into contact with endocrine disruptors, neurotoxins, carcinogens, hormones, and a variety of other contaminants whose long-term biological effects aren't even known. In the United States, tens of thousands of chemicals are used in commercial applications, but only a small fraction of them have been studied by the EPA. Although no one can completely shield themselves from this reality, exposure to toxic substances is not evenly distributed. Rather, uneven levels of exposure reflect broader patterns of social stratification with respect to class, gender, race, and geopolitics. As sociologist Ulrich Beck has observed, wealth accumulates at the top of the socioeconomic ladder and risks at the bottom. Since the 1960s, concerns over toxic pollution have been at the heart of environmental movements around the world. In the United States, Europe, and other highly industrialized societies, these movements have succeeded in pushing through environmental regulations, such as the Clean Air Act in the US, that have reduced certain forms of pollution. Unfortunately, though, just as the costs and benefits of industrial production are not shared equally, the benefits of these regulations are uneven in their application. At the global scale, the deregulation of trade has enabled the outsourcing of polluting industries to countries like China that have lower wages and weaker regulations. Perhaps you've seen the images of dense smog in Beijing or the hyper-colored rivers in the countryside. Some of that pollution is generated by industrial production that serves domestic demand, but much of it results from the manufacture of products for export. In addition, developing countries often import toxic waste from wealthier countries where disposal is more strictly regulated and therefore more expensive. To use the language of economics, many of the environmental costs of US consumer society are being externalized to China and other developing countries. We also see the effects of this unevenness when disaster strikes. From the calamitous gas leak in Bhopal, India, to the widespread petroleum contamination in the Ecuadorian Amazon, when US-based corporations are involved in environmental disasters abroad, they are rarely held to the same level of accountability that they would face for similar incidents here. Multinational corporations employ sophisticated legal maneuvers to shield themselves from liability and to lobby for favorable provisions in free trade agreements. It's important to bear in mind that this pattern exists not just between countries, but also within them. In the United States, studies have shown that people of color are much more likely than whites to live near toxic facilities. And, as the scandal over lead pollution in the waters of Flint, Michigan has made clear, marginalized communities are often neglected by regulators. Earlier I mentioned that toxic pollution has been a major concern of environmental movements in the United States, and that these movements have succeeded in advocating for more stringent environmental regulations. Critics, however, have observed that these movements have primarily represented the interests of middle-class and elite whites. This, they argue, has led to a not in my backyard or NIMBY phenomenon, whereby privileged communities are increasingly able to protect themselves from toxic exposure, leaving less privileged communities to bear that exposure instead. Activists working under the banner of environmental justice have formed a parallel movement that explicitly links social inequality to environmental risk. Since its origins among African American activists working in the US South, environmental justice has become a global call to action for those who see greater social equity as a prerequisite for addressing environmental problems that exist both within national boundaries and between them. As a result, questions of justice and equity are increasingly central to environmental debates, whether at the level of polluted neighborhoods or the global climate. Environmental scholar Rob Nixon has coined the term slow violence to describe the cumulative health effects that toxic pollution has on many marginalized communities. Our materials for this week will confront us with examples of slow violence from different parts of the world. As you consider these examples, focus on how geopolitical boundaries, socioeconomic structures, and racial inequalities shape people's exposure to toxics, on how polluters avoid accountability and activists demand it, and how social policies and environmental policies go hand in hand. What sorts of policies, both nationally and internationally, could address unevenness in protections from toxic pollution?